I always believed the ranch was my sanctuary, the one place where the madness of the HOA board and their endless crusades couldn't reach me. But that illusion shattered the night the knock came at midnight, sharp and deliberate, echoing through the wooden frame of my front door like a warning shot in the silence. And when I pulled the curtain back just enough to peer outside, I saw them. Two men in police uniforms standing beneath the porch light, badges catching the glow, hands resting casually on their belts as if they belonged there. But something in the stiffness of their posture, the way their eyes scanned too deliberately, made my stomach knot. Because I'd lived long enough to know what real lawmen carried in their stance, and these two were missing it entirely, their presence rehearsed rather than ingrained. And yet they knocked again, louder this time, their shadows stretching across the porch, and in the faint distance I thought I saw a third figure by the gate, a dark silhouette half hidden by the oak tree, watching, waiting, like a wolf testing the fence line before it lunges. And in that moment I understood this wasn't routine, wasn't coincidence. This was something orchestrated, deliberate, the HOA's hand reaching farther than ever before. And when I finally opened the door a crack, just enough to let the chain hold firm, the taller one leaned in close, his breath carrying the faint smell of cheap aftershave, his voice low but hard. "Evening, sir." "Sheriff's office. We've had reports about disturbances coming from this property. Need to step inside and take a look." And the words hung there. Carefully chosen, but the cadence was wrong. Too formal in one breath and too casual in the next. Like a child reciting lines from a play, and I said nothing at first, letting the silence hang heavy between us, because I knew better than to confirm or deny anything until I'd taken their measure. And that's when the shorter one shifted his weight, his hand brushing against what looked like a holstered weapon, though the leather was too new, the belt too stiff. And I realized with a jolt that whatever sat there wasn't department-issued, wasn't regulation. It was theater. All of it. The uniforms, the badges, the stance. A performance meant to intimidate, to force me into compliance. And I felt the first surge of anger mixing with fear, because I knew exactly who had sent them. And the HOA had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, because now it wasn't about fines or citations or letters stuffed in my mailbox. It was about trespass, impersonation, and a direct attempt to shake me down. And as the taller one leaned harder against the doorframe, eyes narrowing as though daring me to resist, I caught sight of something that sealed it for me, the patch on his shoulder. A cheap imitation of the county's real insignia. The colors slightly wrong, the stitching uneven, and I almost laughed in disbelief at the audacity of it. But instead I let my voice stay calm. Deliberate, controlled. "If you boys are with the sheriff, then you won't mind me giving him a call before I let you inside." And the pause that followed was sharper than any blade, because for the first time their act faltered, the taller one's jaw tightening, the shorter one shifting his gaze just long enough to betray the crack in their armor. And in that instant, the silence between us wasn't just heavy, it was dangerous, electric, the kind that sparks just before the explosion. And I knew whatever came next would decide whether this was intimidation or escalation, and my hand hovered near the phone in my pocket, ready to call the real sheriff, while my other hand held the chain-locked door steady, muscles taut, heart pounding. And as their eyes flicked toward each other in a silent exchange, I realized the game had only just begun. Because the HOA wasn't sending letters anymore. They were sending wolves dressed as lawmen. And I had just dared to bare my teeth back. The night it all began, I knew something was off before the first knock even echoed against my wooden front door. Because out here on the edge of the county, miles from town, people didn't just show up unannounced after midnight. And the sound of tires crunching on the gravel drive had already snapped me out of a shallow, restless sleep. The neighborhood HOA had been escalating for weeks. Letters, fines, veiled threats, and their smug president who thought her little board of retirees and busybodies could intimidate me into submission. But when you've been in the military, when you've spent years learning to read people's intent in the space between heartbeats, you recognize the difference between a bureaucratic nuisance and something far darker. And as I eased the curtain back just an inch, the sweep of headlights across the yard revealed two black and white cruisers that didn't look like any official sheriff's units I'd ever seen. Their decals cheap, almost reflective stickers instead of paint. their light bars casting the kind of blue glow you only find on knockoff imports. And in that instant, a cold certainty pressed into my spine. The HOA hadn't sent a lawyer this time. They'd sent wolves dressed as sheep. Imposters with badges bought online, men playing cops because they thought a uniform could mask their malice. I watched them step out, two men in tactical boots and mismatched belts. Their holsters slung too low, their shirts crisp but untucked. And though they carried themselves like authority, there was hesitation in their movements. The way their eyes darted to the shadows around the porch. The way they lingered by their cars as though waiting for me to come out first. And I almost laughed because these weren't cops. They were actors in a play staged by people too arrogant to understand the danger of improvising in the wrong man's home. Yet as I reached for the shotgun propped beside the door, my knuckles brushing the cool steel of the barrel. The knock came again, harder this time, faster, deliberate, echoing through the empty hall like a battering ram testing the hinges, and a voice called out, deep and commanding but rehearsed, like someone had practiced it in the mirror. "Sheriff's Department, open up!" And I nearly smiled at the irony, because the real sheriff of this county was an old hunting buddy of mine, a man who would sooner trust his life to me in a firefight than to the paper pushers downtown. A man who'd warned me weeks ago that the HOA had been whispering in circles they had no business whispering in. And if he were truly here, he'd be calling me by name, telling me to put the coffee on, not barking like a second-rate stage cop trying to sound official in the dark. But still I waited, breathing slow, counting the seconds between their fists hitting the door, the weight of the shotgun grounding me in calm. And then came the words that shifted everything. Words hissed low, not meant for me to hear. One of the men muttering to the other, "If he doesn't open, we break it. Orders are orders." And in that instant the game ended. Because trespassing was one thing, intimidation was another. But forced entry in the dead of night? That was war, and war was something I'd always been prepared for. The latch clicked softly as I unlocked the door, but I didn't open it. Not yet. I wanted them leaning forward off balance, arrogant in their assumption of control. So when I finally swung it wide, the dim porch light catching my face, my stance square in the doorway with the barrel angled just low enough not to count as a direct threat, I let silence hang heavy, their fake badges gleaming dull under the yellow bulb, their smirks faltering as recognition settled that this wasn't the scared homeowner they'd been promised. This was someone who could see through them. And the taller one spoke first, voice strained now. "Sir, we've had complaints about your property, need to ask a few questions." But I cut him off with a single sentence that turned their confidence to ash. "Funny. Because the real sheriff is on his way," I said evenly, though I hadn't called him yet, but the bluff landed hard. Their eyes flicking toward each other, uncertainty cracking their facade. And for a heartbeat, the only sounds were the cicadas in the fields and the low snort of my horses restless in the barn. Until tires crunched again from down the road. Real headlights sweeping in this time, brighter, familiar, steady. And when the county cruiser rolled into view, the emblem painted with the precision no counterfeit could match. I saw the blood drain from their faces as Sheriff Walker himself stepped out, hand resting on his holster, eyes scanning the scene with the cool calculation of a man who'd been told half the story already. And as he closed the car door, boots striking gravel with the weight of authority that couldn't be faked, he said only one thing before the night detonated into chaos. "Boys, I sure hope you've got real badges, because if not, you just picked the wrong damn ranch." And before I could even answer, the imposters moved, one reaching for his belt, the other stepping back toward the SUV, and everything I thought I understood about the HOA's petty war against me twisted into something far more sinister. Because these men weren't just board puppets playing intimidation, they were professionals hiding behind a mask. And the way their eyes hardened at the sheriff's presence told me this wasn't going to end with words. The night froze in a suspended breath as Sheriff Walker's words cut through the air. And in the instant those fake cops twitched toward their belts, every nerve in my body fired into overdrive, training kicking in like an old song I'd never forgotten. Because in the war zones overseas, I'd learned that the most dangerous men weren't the ones who shouted or postured, but the ones who stayed quiet until the second they struck. And that's exactly what I saw in their eyes, dead silence. Predatory focus, a cold willingness to escalate. And though my finger never touched the trigger guard, my shotgun rose a fraction higher, enough to tilt the balance of power back in my favor while Walker's hand hovered near his sidearm, calm but ready, his voice low and edged with steel. "Bad idea, son. You so much as blink wrong and I'll put you down before you hit the gravel." Yet instead of compliance, the shorter man smirked, a cruel curl of his lips, and muttered, "This ain't your call, Sheriff. This is bigger than you." Words that told me everything, that these weren't just HOA goons playing dress-up. They were part of something orchestrated, something with layers deeper than neighborhood squabbles, because no homeowners association, no matter how arrogant, could bankroll men this disciplined, with counterfeit cruisers, matching sidearms, and the kind of cold confidence that comes only from being used to violence. And for a fraction of a second, I wondered just how far the HOA president had gone, what kind of devils she'd invited into our quiet rural county. But then the taller one moved, fast and decisive, reaching not for his weapon but for his radio, snapping a code into the night that I didn't recognize, but Walker sure did, because his expression hardened instantly, his pistol clearing leather in a motion too fast for the eye to track, the metallic click echoing like thunder as he barked, "Drop it, now!" And the tension shattered, the imposter freezing mid-motion, his fake badge gleaming in the porch light, his other hand raised slowly as the one with the smirk stepped backward toward their SUV, hand inching to his waist. And I knew if he made it to that car, if he reached whatever was waiting inside, this night would spiral into something catastrophic, so I shifted, voice sharp as a blade. "Don't even think about it." And for a moment his eyes locked with mine. Calculating, and I saw it, the faintest flicker of recognition, like he knew me, like my face was not unfamiliar. And that rattled me more than his weapon, because how the hell could a stranger dressed in a fake deputy uniform know anything about me? The standoff stretched thin. Walker's pistol steady, my shotgun locked, the imposters caught between fight and surrender, until finally the taller one let his radio clatter to the dirt, the sound loud in the silence. But the smirking one only chuckled, low and dangerous, and said something that chilled me to the bone. "You think tonight's about you? But you're just a test. Orders are already in motion." My heart stuttered because in that moment I realized we weren't stopping an attack. We'd stumbled into the middle of an operation already underway, and before Walker could respond, headlights flared in the distance, more vehicles coming fast down the gravel road, their beams slicing through the dark like knives, the growl of engines too many to count. And Walker swore under his breath, radioing for backup, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying what we both knew. This wasn't going to be a simple arrest. This was about to turn into a siege. The fake cops didn't wait for reinforcements. The smirker dove for his SUV, flinging open the back door, and I caught the glint of a rifle case inside, my pulse slamming as Walker shouted for me to get down. But instead of retreating, I surged forward, shoving the shotgun stock against my shoulder, firing a warning blast into the dirt by his boots that sprayed gravel and made him stumble back, just enough to freeze his reach, my voice booming over the chaos. "You take one more inch and you don't walk away." His eyes, wide now, flicked from me to Walker, weighing odds, realizing maybe for the first time that his script didn't account for a homeowner who fought back and a sheriff who wasn't bought. But before he could recalculate, the incoming vehicles roared closer, dust rising like a storm. And I saw the HOA president's shiny white SUV in the lead, her silhouette unmistakable, smug even at a distance. And rage burned hot in my chest, because she hadn't just threatened me. She'd delivered armed imposters to my doorstep like I was prey, and now she was brazen enough to show up herself, flanked by more shadows stepping from trucks, men in the same cheap uniforms, a whole squad of fakes, and Walker hissed through clenched teeth. "This is bigger than I thought. Don't shoot unless they fire first." But my gut screamed that waiting would get us killed. The SUVs skidded to a halt, doors slamming, boots crunching gravel. And in the silence before the storm, I heard the president's voice carry, smug and venomous, "You should have just paid the fines, cowboy. Now you're going to learn who really runs this county." It was almost laughable. Her HOA delusion stretched to madness, but behind her bravado was real muscle. Men trained, armed, and organized, and for the first time in years, I felt the old battle thrill shiver through me, the predator's calm before blood spills. Walker stepped forward, his badge gleaming. Voice thunderous. "You're impersonating law enforcement, trespassing, and threatening a citizen on his property. You're under arrest." But she only smirked, raising a hand, and at her signal, the men fanned out, rifles slung, not even pretending anymore. And that's when I knew the line had been crossed. This wasn't intimidation, it was an invasion. I shifted closer to Walker, low and grim, whispering, "We can't hold them all off," and he muttered back, "We don't have to, backup's rolling, but we just need to survive until then." And survival meant blood, grit, and fire. The imposters advanced, slow, deliberate. The smirker now armed with his rifle, eyes locked on me, and the taller one retrieving his radio again, spitting codes into the night like coordinates. And my mind spun. Who were they signaling? What network was this? How deep did it go? But there was no time for answers, only action. And as the first beam of a rifle laser painted my chest, my breath slowed, my finger tightened, and I knew that the first shot would unleash hell across this quiet patch of earth, dragging me, Walker, and every secret behind this masquerade into a storm none of us were ready for. And then, with the sheriff's voice booming, "Last warning!" and the president's hand dropping in a signal, the world fractured into chaos as the imposters raised their rifles as one. The rifles snapped upward in unison, red dots dancing across the siding of my house, one even cutting across my chest like a taunt, and before thought could catch up, instinct ripped through me, my finger squeezing. The roar of the shotgun tearing the night wide open as buckshot slammed into the gravel at their feet, scattering rocks like shrapnel and forcing the front line to stagger back. Just as Walker's pistol cracked twice, precise, controlled, driving them to cover behind their SUVs, and in a heartbeat the quiet ranch became a war zone. Muzzle flashes strobing the dark, the air filling with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Bullets sparking off the iron gate and punching splinters from my porch posts, and I dove hard to the left, rolling behind the tractor for cover as Walker dropped to one knee behind his cruiser, returning fire with the calm of a man who'd been in more firefights than he cared to count. But no matter how sharp our aim, the math was brutal. 2 men against nearly a dozen, all armed, all organized. And my mind screamed strategy even as my heart thundered, "Hold them long enough for backup. Bleed their confidence, use the land, use the dark." I racked the shotgun, leaned around the tractor's wheel well, and fired again, the blast catching the smirker's rifle, shattering the stock into splinters and wrenching it from his hands, his snarl twisting into rage as he dove for cover. And I felt a flicker of savage satisfaction, but it died quick as rounds chewed through the tractor hood inches from my face, metal pinging and oil spraying forcing me down. Walker's voice cut through the gunfire. "They're trained, damn it! They're not just HOA muscle!" And I shouted back, "I know!" Because the way they moved, covering each other, advancing in pairs, it was textbook paramilitary. And that terrified me more than the bullets. The realization that this wasn't a neighborhood dispute gone wrong. It was a shadow war bleeding into our quiet county, and I was the spark they'd chosen to ignite it. I scrambled low across the dirt, diving behind a stack of hay bales, the dry grass exploding into dust as rounds ripped through it. And I could hear the HOA president barking orders, her voice sharp, commanding. No longer the whiny tone of a suburban tyrant, but clipped, professional. Like someone used to giving commands in operations far darker than HOA meetings, and bile rose in my throat at the truth snapping into place. She wasn't just a petty, power-drunk neighbor, she was connected, bankrolling or working with people who had training, resources, purpose. And I'd become the target because I refused to bend. A bullet hissed past my ear, slamming into the wood post behind me, and I rolled again, slamming a fresh shell into the shotgun, my pulse steadying with the rhythm of action, survival now muscle memory. Walker's cruiser lights still flashed, painting the chaos in red and blue, and I used the strobe to mask my movement, sprinting low toward the barn, rounds chasing me but failing to track cleanly in the pulsing dark. until I slid through the open doors, slamming them shut behind me and plunging into shadow. My bulls snorted nervously, massive silhouettes shifting in their pens, and a savage thought sparked. The land itself was my weapon. I grabbed the latch, flung it free, and with a bellow like thunder, 3 of the beasts charged out into the night, 2 tons of horn and fury exploding from the barn straight toward the line of imposters crouched by the SUVs. And chaos erupted, men shouting, stumbling, firing blindly as the animals thundered through them, scattering their formation, smashing into metal with bone-crunching force, one SUV rocking sideways under the impact. Walker seized the moment, rising from cover, his pistol cracking deliberate, precise shots that dropped one man screaming to the ground and forced the others to scatter wider, buying us precious ground. I stormed out behind the bulls, firing again, my shell ripping into a tire, the SUV sagging on its rim, sparks flashing as it tried to move. For the first time, the fakes faltered, their tight lines broken, their advance stuttering, and the president shrieked over the gunfire. "Hold the line, you useless cowards!" But I could hear the edge of panic under her command, the confidence cracking. And then headlights flared again, not from the road but from the pasture behind, and my stomach dropped as more vehicles roared in from the rear, cutting off escape, box-trapping us on my own land, and I realized the ambush was deeper than we'd known. They hadn't just come to threaten, they'd come to erase. Walker cursed, ducking as rounds tore chips from his cruiser, and he yelled, "We're boxed! Call it in!" But my phone was back in the house, useless, and before I could answer, a blinding spotlight from one of the rear trucks locked on me, bathing me in white, and a voice boomed through a megaphone. Cold, precise. "Stand down. You've made your point. Now surrender or we burn this place to the ground." My throat went dry. Because this wasn't HOA language, this was military ultimatum. And the sight of canisters being shouldered from the truck, grenade launchers, not toys, told me they weren't bluffing. The barn behind me was dry timber, the fields brittle with summer heat. One incendiary and everything I'd built would go up in flames, livestock and all. I looked to Walker. His jaw clenched, eyes flicking, weighing options. And I saw the moment he made his call, he holstered his pistol, stood tall in the flashing light, and shouted back, "This is Sheriff Walker of Carson County. You fire 1 round on this property and you'll answer to the state, the feds, and God himself." His voice carried like a hammer, defiant, unshakable, but the response was chilling laughter from the megaphone, followed by 5 words that dropped ice into my gut. "We don't answer to them." The spotlight intensified. The men raised their launchers, and in that instant I knew the line had snapped. Law. Reason and order meant nothing here. This was raw power, shadow command, and if they burned me tonight, the county would never know the truth. It would just be another quiet tragedy folded into rumor. My hands tightened on the shotgun, sweat slicking the grip, and I whispered to Walker, "Then we make them answer." And before either of us could blink, the night detonated again as the first canister arced into the air, trailing sparks toward the barn, and everything slowed. The fire, the bulls, the imposters, the sheriff, the HOA president watching with a predator's smile as the world tilted toward flames, and I realized Section 2 of this nightmare wasn't ending with survival, but with the ignition of something far larger than either of us ever imagined. The canister spun through the night like a comet, its sparks painting arcs across the black sky. And in that frozen instant before impact, I felt a sick twist in my gut because I knew what was about to happen. The way you know a storm is coming even before the first raindrop, and then it hit. A hollow metallic thud as it bounced once against the packed dirt before rolling into the dry straw scattered outside the barn. And in a breath, the world bloomed into fire, flames leaping with a hungry roar, devouring straw, licking at the wooden siding with greedy tongues, and the animals inside screamed in panic. Bulls crashing against their pens, horses thrashing, the barn transforming into a furnace, and rage thundered through me so hot it almost drowned out the fear. Because they hadn't just come for me, they'd come to burn my land, my history, my family's blood carved into these boards. And that was the moment the fight stopped being about survival and became war. Walker shouted something, orders, warnings. I couldn't hear, because the crack of rifles and the roar of fire blurred everything into chaos. But my body moved anyway, sprinting toward the barn door, ignoring the bullets snapping the dirt around my feet, ignoring Walker's curse behind me, because the thought of letting my animals roast alive was worse than the risk of catching lead, and I tore the latch open, heat blasting me like a wall, smoke clawing my throat, and in the inferno I saw their eyes wide with terror, whites gleaming in the firelight, and I screamed, "Go!" slapping their haunches, driving them into the night, stumbling back as one bull nearly trampled me in his panic, but at least they were out. At least they had a chance, though as I turned back, fire was already chewing through the roof beams, embers raining, and I knew the barn was lost. I staggered into the open again, coughing, my vision swimming, and Walker was there, hauling me by the arm, his face streaked with sweat and soot, yelling over the chaos, "We're not going to win this firefight, we need to move!" But even as he said it, even as logic told me retreat was the only option, another volley of canisters hissed through the air, exploding on impact with choking smoke, acrid and blinding, chemicals stinging my eyes, burning my lungs, and I realized they weren't just burning me out, they were flushing us, driving us where they wanted, herding us like prey, and Walker saw it too because his grip tightened and he snarled, "They're trying to box us into the ravine." He was right. The terrain sloped down behind the barn into a gulch, and if they drove us there, pinned us between fire and rifles, it'd be a slaughter. I forced myself upright, blinking through the haze, and spotted the president standing smug behind her men, her face lit orange by the flames, shouting orders into a radio that gleamed too high-tech for any HOA budget. And something in me snapped. I raised the shotgun, ignoring the sting in my eyes, and fired. The shot ripping into the SUV beside her, glass shattering, metal shrieking, sending her diving behind cover with a scream. And though I missed flesh, I saw something more valuable. Fear. She wasn't untouchable, she wasn't the commander she pretended to be. She was flesh and bone and vulnerable, and that knowledge steeled me as Walker dragged me back toward the tree line, firing controlled bursts that dropped another imposter who'd gotten too bold. We crashed into the pines, branches clawing at us, gunfire chasing close, and for a moment I thought we'd lost them in the dark. But then beams of tactical flashlights cut through the smoke, men shouting, fanning out, disciplined, not the sloppy chaos of thugs, but the coordinated sweep of soldiers. And that terrified me more than the fire. They were trained. They were funded, and if they were here under the guise of an HOA dispute, then the rabbit hole went deeper than I dared imagine. We ducked behind a fallen log, lungs heaving, Walker whispering through gritted teeth, "We need comms. My cruiser radio's dead with the battery shot out, and they've jammed cell signals. I can't raise dispatch." And my stomach turned cold because it explained everything. Why no sirens had screamed down the road yet? Why backup hadn't rolled in? These bastards were jamming the county net, isolating us, making sure no cavalry came. And it hit me. This wasn't just about me. This was about control. Testing how far they could push before law collapsed, and I whispered, "This isn't HOA, this is paramilitary," and Walker's grim nod told me he'd already come to the same conclusion. The fire spread fast, trees catching now, embers spiraling into the night sky like signals to the devil himself, and the heat grew unbearable, painting everything in flickering hell light. But through the crackling I caught faint movement, figures flanking left, trying to box us again, their rifles gleaming. I motioned to Walker, and together we slithered deeper down the slope, boots silent in the pine needles, breath shallow, every sound amplified, the crunch of gravel, the metallic click of safeties, the president's voice still calling orders, furious, unhinged. Then, a sound that froze me, the low hum of a drone. I glanced up, and there it was, a quadcopter hovering above the treetops, its red eye blinking, sweeping the woods with infrared, hunting us like dogs. My gut clenched. They weren't amateurs with rifles. They had surveillance tech. They had command-level equipment, and suddenly every escape route felt impossible. Walker C. Walker cursed under his breath, whispered, "We need to take it out." But neither of us had range in the smoke, and before we could decide, the drone locked its gaze, a laser pointer beam scanning, and the voices surged louder, closer, men closing in. My mind raced. options dwindling, until desperation sparked. I yanked the last shell from my pocket, loaded, waited for the drone to dip lower in the smoky turbulence, and then fired blind through the haze, the recoil slamming my shoulder. And by some miracle, sparks erupted. The drone whined, spun, and smashed into the trees in a shower of plastic and flame. The woods cheered with gunfire in response, their line accelerating, angry, and Walker and I bolted deeper, branches whipping, lungs burning, until the slope opened into the gulch, a dry riverbed littered with rocks, moonlight spilling silver across it. And my heart dropped because we'd hit the trap after all, pinned in the open, high ridges on both sides, and their silhouettes already blocking the rim. Walker swore, drawing his backup pistol, tossing me a spare mag, his voice low but steady. "We make them bleed for every inch. And we don't die here." His defiance lit something in me, and I nodded, bracing against the rocks, raising my shotgun as figures descended, muzzle flashes bursting, dirt spraying, bullets ricocheting in sparks. We fired back, the gulch exploding with echoes. Men dropping, others screaming, the night turning into pure chaos. But for everyone that fell, two more pushed. Relentless. And I knew we couldn't hold forever. Then, over the thunder, came the sound that made my chest clench with desperate hope. The distant wail of sirens. Faint but rising, faint but real, a sound like salvation clawing through the static. And I glanced at Walker, his eyes flaring, both of us realizing the same thing. Somehow word had gotten out. Maybe a neighbor saw the fire, maybe a deputy on patrol noticed the jamming. Maybe luck had finally tilted, but whatever it was, real law was coming. And the imposters knew it too because their fire grew more frantic, less disciplined, urgency in their shouts as they tried to finish us before backup arrived. The president screamed from the ridge, her voice shrill and cracking, "Finish it now!" And her desperation told me something critical. They weren't authorized to be exposed. If the real deputies rolled in and saw them with rifles, fake uniforms, fire at their backs, their entire operation would unravel, and that was leverage, even if it was just time. Walker grabbed my arm, shouting, "Hold, just hold!" as the sirens grew louder, and for a moment I let myself believe we might make it. But then a round tore past, grazing Walker's side, his grunt sharp. Blood blooming through his shirt, and rage tore through me hotter than the fire. I rose from cover, screaming, firing both barrels at the ridge where the president crouched. Splinters exploding around her, forcing her to duck. Her command cut off mid-sentence, and for a heartbeat her squad faltered, uncertain without orders. But the pause was shattered by the arrival of more lights cresting the road. Real cruisers this time. Their spotlights sweeping, sirens howling, engines growling, and I almost laughed with relief until I noticed the imposters didn't scatter. They didn't run. Instead, the smirker, alive and grinning through blood on his cheek, raised a hand signal and his men shifted tactics, pulling back not in retreat but in discipline, dragging their wounded, slipping into shadows, melting away like ghosts as if this had all been an exercise, not a battle. The president vanished with them, her SUV tearing off across the ridge, leaving us in smoke and fire as the real deputies poured in. Weapons drawn, shouting confusion, stumbling into a war zone already fading into silence. Walker collapsed against the rocks, blood soaking his side, my hand scrambling to press pressure. My ears ringing from sirens and gunfire and fire roaring behind us, and as the deputies swarmed, demanding answers, faces wide with disbelief, I realized with a sick certainty that this wasn't the end, but the beginning. Because those imposters hadn't failed, they'd tested, probed and disappeared, leaving us as the only witnesses, and already I could see doubt in the deputies' eyes. Confusion as they looked at the burning barn, at Walker bleeding, at me covered in soot and blood, and the words that left the youngest deputy's lips froze me in dread. "Sir, we didn't see anyone else. Are you sure you weren't just shooting at shadows?" And in that moment I understood. The enemy wasn't gone. They'd slipped deeper, invisible. And now we were the ones who looked insane. And Section 3 ended not with victory, but with the terrible weight of realizing we were up against something powerful enough to fight us in the open and still vanish like smoke, leaving us alone to face the fire and suspicion of our own law. The night bled into morning with the kind of stillness that only follows chaos. The kind where every sound, wind rattling the barn doors, the shuffle of boots in wet gravel, the low murmur of radios crackling with clipped voices, felt amplified, like the land itself was holding its breath as the truth of what had just unfolded began to settle in. And as I stood there, shotgun still heavy in my hands, I realized that the facade of the HOA as a petty neighborhood committee had been burned away completely, revealing the rot beneath, a web of greed, desperation, and criminal arrogance that had reached far deeper than anyone could have guessed. The fake cops lay cuffed in the dirt, their faces pale under the rising sun, sweat streaking down as Sheriff Walker and his deputies searched them with the cold precision of men who'd seen enough imposters to recognize the danger of hesitation. And though part of me wanted to step forward, to demand answers, to strip them of every smug smile they had carried into my driveway, I held back because Walker had taken command, his gravelly voice cutting the air like a blade. "This isn't just HOA business anymore. This is organized crime in my county." His deputies nodded, hauling the men up and into the back of the cruiser. But the story wasn't finished. It wasn't even close because the taller imposter, Riker, as his partner had called him in a panicked slip, looked at me over his shoulder with a gaze that wasn't fear, wasn't regret, but something sharper, a promise unspoken. And I knew then this wasn't going to end with a single night's arrests. This was only the edge of a much larger war. Walker approached, his hat tilted low, his jaw tight as he spoke quietly enough only I could hear. "These aren't just hired muscle. They've got training, military, maybe mercenary. And if your HOA president brought them in, she's sitting on something bigger than property disputes." His words confirmed what my gut had been screaming since the first letter, since the first smirk across the HOA table. This had never been about paint colors or fence heights. It was about leverage, power, and money. And somehow my land, my ranch, was caught at the center of it. Maybe because of its position, maybe because of what lay underneath. And suddenly I thought of the old surveyor maps tucked away in my father's desk. Maps that showed not just boundaries, but underground resources, easements, water rights stretching far past what the HOA controlled. And the realization struck cold. They weren't trying to bully me for appearances. They were trying to force me out, to gain control of something far more valuable than cattle pasture. But answers would have to wait, because just as Walker began to radio dispatch for federal coordination, headlights flared again at the end of the road. This time not one vehicle but a convoy, sleek black SUVs, their engines growling low like predators circling prey. And before I could ask, Walker muttered, "That's them! More of them!" And his hand slid toward his weapon. His deputies stiffening, a thin line of law against whatever was coming down that dirt track. And I felt the tension surge again. The familiar taste of adrenaline at the back of my throat, the echo of deployments long past. The SUVs stopped short, dust curling in the morning air, and out stepped three figures not in uniforms, not in suits, but in plain clothes that screamed money and confidence. And at the center was her, the HOA president, Mrs. Caldwell, flanked by two men with shoulders too broad and eyes too still to be mere board members. And she smiled as though arriving at a garden party, her voice dripping with condescension as she called out, "Sheriff Walker, what a surprise to see you meddling in homeowner business." Walker didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact as he replied, "Impersonating law enforcement isn't homeowner business. It's a felony. And hiring mercs to intimidate a veteran on his own land? That's conspiracy." Caldwell's smile thinned, but she didn't back down, instead stepping forward slowly, her heels crunching gravel, her words slicing through the rising sunlit air. "You don't understand, Sheriff. This land isn't his. It never was. He's sitting on something he can't protect, something that belongs to all of us, and I won't let one stubborn man keep progress from happening." Her eyes flicked to me, sharp and venomous, and in that moment I realized what she meant. Water. The aquifer beneath my ranch. The one my father had once mentioned could sustain half the county if tapped. The one that private investors would kill to control. And suddenly it all made sense. The harassment, the fake fines, the false cops. It wasn't pettiness. It was strategy. a coordinated push to seize resources hidden under my feet. But she had overplayed her hand, speaking too boldly in front of Walker, who raised a hand to his deputies, signaling them to stand ready, his voice steady as iron. "Caldwell, you just confessed in front of lawmen. Step back before this gets worse." Yet instead of retreating, she snapped her fingers and her two men reached under their jackets, weapons gleaming in the dawn light, and everything detonated into motion. The deputies raising their rifles, my own shotgun snapping up in instinct, Walker shouting commands drowned in the sudden crack of gunfire, gravel exploding around us as bullets ricocheted, the horses screaming in the barn, the air thick with dust and smoke. I dropped to a knee, firing back, the recoil punching my shoulder as one of Caldwell's men stumbled, clutching his arm, but the other pressed forward, his pistol spitting rounds with terrifying calm, forcing us back toward the porch. And through it all, Caldwell stood like a queen surveying her battlefield, untouched, smiling as though this chaos was exactly what she'd planned. Seconds stretched into eternities until the sound of sirens cut through the gunfire. Not fake this time, not knockoffs, but the wail of real reinforcements cresting the ridge. County units followed by unmarked vehicles that screamed federal. And in that moment the tide shifted, the gunman faltered. The deputies pressed forward, and Walker himself tackled him to the ground, wrenching the weapon free with the kind of strength only born from rage contained too long. Caldwell's smile vanished as agents in tactical gear surrounded her, hands forcing her wrists into cuffs as she spat venom, her words shrill now, desperate. "You don't know what you're doing. This land will never be his. You can't stop what's coming." But her voice was drowned beneath the thrum of rotors overhead, helicopters cutting the dawn sky as the full weight of justice descended on my ranch. And though part of me felt relief, another part, deeper, colder, knew she wasn't lying entirely because people like her never operated alone, and whatever network she was tied into wouldn't collapse just because one queen had been captured. Hours later, when the sun was high and the smoke cleared, I stood with Walker by the fence line, the wreckage of the night scattered around us, cuffed men in the back of vans, weapons tagged and bagged, evidence teams combing through SUV compartments, and Walker lit a cigarette with a shaking hand, exhaling slow as he finally spoke. "You were right to stand your ground. But this goes higher than the HOA. This is something bigger, and it won't end here." I nodded, staring out at the fields my father had walked, the land I had fought for, the ranch that had nearly been stolen not by greed alone, but by conspiracy. And though exhaustion weighed heavy, though every muscle ached, I knew the fight wasn't over. But for now, just for now, I had won, and as the last of the convoys pulled away, as the ranch settled back into uneasy silence, I whispered a promise to the land itself. They would never take it, not while I still drew breath. But in the quiet that followed, as crows gathered on the fence posts and the wind shifted cold, I couldn't shake Caldwell's final words, couldn't silence the echo of her laugh carried off in chains, and I realized that while the battle was done, the war was only beginning, and somewhere out there beyond the horizon, the next move was already being planned.